لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين صلوات الله وسلامه عليه وعليهم أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما آمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you back to our course on understanding Shafi'i fiqh based on Imam al-Shatiri's al-Yaqut al-Nafis. This is a level 3 course and this is class number 3. In this course, we seek to cover the principles, maxims and practical application of Shafi'i fiqh. Herein we look at, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, the purification process, ablution, wudu. We have started defining what purification is, its purpose and its application, the various means to attain purification, and we have looked at the obligatory portions of the wudu. In this course, we seek to grasp the core legal principles, to approach fiqh systematically and methodologically, to connect basic knowledge with real life, to access a contemporary text used by scholars and students, and to master definitions, conditions, and applications of fiqh. In this lesson, we will seek to define purification and its purpose, to learn the obligatory acts, conditions, sunnahs, and nullifiers of wudu, and to apply practically the rules in different scenarios. Some key concepts is to take note of the difference between ritual purity versus physical cleanliness, because we often confuse this in daily life situations. To look at wudu as a prerequisite for worship, and to have a clear distinction between the obligations, the fara'id, as well as the sunnah acts. Now, this is the lesson pertaining to mashul khuffain in summary, right? So you don't have to understand it from this page. It's just a mind map to lay out for you what it is that we intend to cover here under the title of the khufs, the two khufs. Mash literally means to wipe over or to wipe, from the word masaha. Masaha yamsahu means to wipe. And then al-khuffain refers to the two socks. Okay, as for the description of the socks, we'll cover that here inshallah. Then the first point is the hukm. يجوز مسح شيء من ظاهر أعلى الخفين بدلا عن غسل الرجلين في الوضوء. يجوز. So the hukm pertaining to wearing the khufs and wiping over them is that it's permissible. Now already this is a key point, because when we learn fiqh, understanding the ahkam gives us perspective. Before studying fiqh, you may think of wearing the khufs as being sunnah. And that would be a very superficial understanding of the sunnah, because that would be understanding the sunnah based on the fact that it's something the Prophet ﷺ did. But when we study fiqh, we don't only ask what did he do and what didn't he do, because sometimes he would do something that according to fiqh would be termed as makruh for us. For example, the Prophet ﷺ reportedly stood and drank, even though it's sunnah to sit and drink. So you may come across the practice or the hadith that mentions that the Prophet ﷺ stood and drank, and you say that because he did it, therefore it's sunnah. Just like because he wiped on the khufs at times, therefore wiping on the khufs is sunnah. But that is an oversimplification. See, according to fiqh, sunnah is ma yuthabu fa'iluhu wa la yu'aqabu tarikuhu. That which the doer gets rewarded and the one who leaves it off doesn't get punished. So in fiqh terms, in legalistic terms, wiping the khufs is not considered sunnah or mustahab. It is considered mubah or yajuz, yani it is permissible to do. So it's not something that you should ideally strive towards. In fact, we should also be able to determine or to distinguish between the two, as in which of the laws is the serious law, the standard law, and which is the dispensation. We refer to the standard or the serious or the default law as the azima, right? Call it the difficult law, call it the standard law. And then when it is lightened and you have a dispensation, we call that the rukhsa, right? The rukhsa is a dispensation, something that the Sharia makes easier for us. And when it comes to wiping over the khufs, it is considered the rukhsa, whereas washing the feet is considered the azima. And according to the Shafi'i school, when you have a rukhsa and an azima, then the azima would be the act, the serious or the default act is the one that brings more reward because it requires more effort and it is technically more hard. So in that sense, we understand that wiping of the khufs is not to be considered as sunnah, but as something that's permissible. Then we are going to discuss the mudda, the period of validity. So how long can you wipe over the khufs for? Then there's the discussion on bidayatul mash. When exactly does the period of wiping start from? And then there is shurutul mashi al-khuffain, the conditions for being able to wipe over one's socks. So those are the three subtopics under this discussion, and then you can see the grayed out blocks is essentially the details that we will discuss under each point, inshallah. So we commence. قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله بعلومه وعلومكم آمين. مسح الخفين, wiping the two khufs. يجوز, it's permissible. مسح, to wipe. شيء, something. من ظاهر, of the outer. أعلى, upper part. الخفين, of the two khufs. Now when we speak about the upper part, so if you imagine my hand to be a foot, right? So here's the leg part and here's the foot and this would be the toes. To wipe any of the top part of the khuf would be permissible. If you suffice yourself with wiping only the top part, then that's permissible. In other words, فَلَا يُجْزِئُ الْإِقْتِصَارُ عَلَى مَسْحِ الْبَاطِنِ وَالْأَسْفَلِ وَالْحَرْفِ وَالْعَقِبِ. What this clause is specifying, ظاهر أعلى الخفين, the outer part of the top of the khuf, is that you cannot limit yourself to only wiping the bottom part of the khuf. In other words, underneath the foot, nor the side of the foot, nor the front, nor the heel. If you're going to limit, then only limit to the top. The ideal method of wiping the khufs is to wipe using the fingers of both hands, and essentially to wipe from the toes with the right hand, wiping towards the leg, and on the left hand, wiping, of course we're talking about the right foot here, so you wipe from the heel with the left hand all the way till the toes. So in other words, you're wiping the top and the bottom simultaneously. That's the ideal way. But if you're going to limit, then يَجُوزُ مَسْحُ شَيْءٍ مِّن ظَاهِرِ أَعْلَى الْخُفَّيْنِ, you can limit to wiping only a portion of the upper part of the outer khuf. Badalan an ghasli rijlain, and you can do so in place of, badalan means as a substitute for, an for ghasli, washing, ar-rijlaini, the 2 feet. And by specifying the washing of the 2 feet, in other words, that wiping the khuf takes the place of washing both feet, what is precluded here is the concept of wiping over one sock and washing the other foot. So if you're going to wipe over the khufs, then it needs to be either both feet that you wipe or you wash both feet. But you can't do half and half. Tamam? Then he says, fil wudu'i, and this is permissible in wudu. So this cannot be done for a ghusl. You can't take a ghusl and then just wipe over the khufs. You can't take a tayammum and then wipe over the khufs. You can't wipe over the khufs in place of istinja. The only place where this is going to be a facility that you can employ is in wudu. Then he speaks about the mudda, the period. So if you go back to the previous slide, you'll see the first subtopic was the mudda, the period. In other words, for how long is one permitted to wipe over the khufs? And the answer is يوما وليلة للمقيم. يوما, a day, وليلة, and a night. So essentially 24 hours or 5 salahs. للمقيم, for one who is a resident. In other words, for a person who is not traveling, right? And the travel that is being referred to here is the same type of travel that would permit shortening and joining of prayers. So if you don't qualify to shorten and join your prayers, then that means you're a muqim, you're a resident, and therefore your period of wiping is maximum 24 hours or a day and a night. وَثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ, and 3 days, بِلَيَالِيهَا, along with their nights, لِلْمُسَافِرِ, for a person who is a traveler. The traveler can wipe for 3 days and 3 nights, so 72 hours. Okay, so that's the duration, the mudda, as to how long they can wipe for. So when does the mudda, the period of wiping, when does it commence? وَتَبْتَدِئُ, and commences, al-muddatu, the period of wiping commences, min, from, intihai, the end of, al-hadathi, the end of that person's state of purification. In other words, the moment that person who put on the khufs, the moment they break their wudu for the first time, right, whether that be through any of the 4 ways of breaking the wudu in the Shafi'i school, then that is going to be the beginning of the period of wiping. So when you put on khufs, we'll get to the point that speaks about you need to put on the khufs while having a complete wudu. But when you have a complete wudu, you put on the khufs, your period of wiping doesn't start from the moment that you put it on, right? Because remember, while you still have that wudu, that specific wudu, you can take off the khuf and you can put it back on again. The only point at which you are now bound to that khuf, you can't take it off, otherwise you're going to need to wash your feet, is the point at which you first break your wudu. Now, about this point, there is some a little bit of detail here, and I'll just mention it briefly, inshallah ta'ala. Now, the detail is that according to Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, right, as well as Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, as well as Khatib Shirbini, this rule is mutlaqan. So, according to those scholars, the moment you break your wudu, no matter how you broke it, that's the period where you're either 24 hours for a resident or 72 hours for a traveler commences from. Tamam? However, the subtle point is that Jamal al-Ramli, he mentions that it only starts from this period if breaking the wudu here is not by the person's own choice. In other words, it's not something that they have complete control over. Ka bawlin wa gha'itin. For example, urination and defecation. Tamam? According to Jamal al-Ramli, if the person broke their wudu by their own choice, right, then the period of wiping commences, according to him, from the beginning, from the first time you put on the khuf. An example of breaking your wudu by your own choice is kalamsin wa naumin, like touching a member of the opposite gender who is non-mahram, or sleeping, not being fixed to the ground. So that's a slight subtle point there, but you don't need to worry about that. The rajih, the preponderant view is that it commences from the time you break your wudu for the first time, and Allah knows best. So let's say you take a complete wudu, you then put on the khufs, and you did so at Fajr time. Then you kept your wudu. Let's say Fajr was at 4 a.m., you kept your wudu 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m., 8 a.m. At 8 a.m., you broke your wudu. That means that you can now wipe for 24 hours starting from 8 a.m. and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Tamam? So that is the period from which the wiping validity commences from. Min intihai al-hadathi, from the point at which the wudu is broken, ba'd al-lubsi, after wearing the khuf. Now we go on to the conditions for wearing the khuf. That, in the previous section, we dealt with the mudda, the period, which is yawman wa layla, a day and a night, lil-muqim, for the resident, ثلاثة أيام بلياليها, 3 days and 3 nights with their, or rather 3 days with their nights for the traveler. And then وَتَبْتَدِئُ الْمُدَّةُ مِنْ انْتِهَاءِ الْحَدَثِ بَعْدَ اللُّبْسِ. Then we spoke about when does the period of wiping begin, and now we are going over to شُرُوطُ الْمَسْحِ عَلَى الْخُفَّيْنِ, the conditions of wiping on the 2 khufs. And as you can see here under, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 conditions. What are they? They are يلبس على طهارة كاملة أن يكون مانعين لنفوذ الماء من غير الخرز. And then 3 أن يكون ساترين لمحل الفرض من الجوانب والأسفل. Then وألا يحصل للابسهما بعد حدث أكبر. ألا يبطل شيء من محل الفرض. I think it's ألا يظهر شيء من محل الفرض is supposed to be. And then وألا تدخل العرى تنحل العرى it's supposed to be. تمام. Sometimes there's a mistake when I copy it over and it's processed and then reading from the Arabic text. Be that as it may, you have the original text in front of you. So we will rely on that primarily, inshallah. What are the conditions as we just read them out? But يشترط is conditioned, is made a shart. لجوازي, for the permission of al-Mashi, for the permission of wiping. What is made a shart? شروط. So شروط is the نائب الفاعل of يشترط. لكن يشترط شروط. So certain conditions are made condition. How many conditions? سبعة. So سبعة is a sifa of شروط. There are 7 conditions for wiping upon the khuf. Number 1, أن يلبس الخفان على طهارة كاملة. أن يلبس, that it be worn. That what be worn? الخفان, that the 2 khufs be worn على طهارة, upon a purification كاملة, a complete purification. In other words, this is precluding the idea of wearing khufs when not having wudu, or wearing khufs when not having a ghusl. You cannot put on khufs if you don't have a complete purification. In other words, you are free from hadathul akbar and hadathul asghar. You have to have a complete wudu and ghusl before you put on your khufs. Number 2, وَأَن يَكُونَ قَوِيَّيْن. The khufs need to be fairly durable. What this refers to is that if you walk around outside without shoes on the khufs directly, then you'll be able to walk for a fairly long distance before they start breaking. So they are strong, right? They won't be broken after just walking 50 or 100 meters. وَأَن يَكُونَ مَانِعَيْنِ لِنُفُوذِ الْمَاءِ. They need to be able to prevent water from reaching the foot if you were to drip water or to pour water over the foot. مِنْ غَيْرِ الْخَرْزِ, but we are not here referring to from the seams. If water reaches the foot after you pour water onto the khuf, but it reaches the foot via the seams where it's stitched together or the like, then this is not going to make it a problem. وَأَن يَكُونَ سَاتِرَيْنِ. Both khufs must completely cover لِمَحَلِّ الْفَرْضِ, the area that is obligatory to wash, which is the entire foot, including up to and including the ankles. مِنَ الْجَوَانِبِ, and it needs to be covered min al-jawanib, from all sides, wal asfal, as well as beneath, as opposed to needing to be covered from the top, because it's open from the top by way of the area where your foot goes in, or the area of the laces. وَأَلَّا يَحْصُلَ لِلَابِسِهِمَا حَدَثٌ أَكْبَرٌ. Another condition is that you wear it while not getting to a point of major impurity. So in other words, if you have physical intimacy with your spouse, or a lady gets a haid or something of the sort that breaks major purity, then that nullifies the wearing of the khufs. One needs to remove the khufs then. You cannot wear khufs while you perform a ghusl and just wipe over the khufs. It doesn't work that way. We've already clarified that. وَأَلَّا يَظْهَرَ شَيْءٌ مِّن مَحَلِّ الْفَرْضِ. And nothing of the area that is obligatory to cover must become exposed while wearing the khufs. If your foot, the area that is wajib to wash in wudu, if any of that becomes exposed while wearing the khufs, then that would nullify wearing of the khufs. وَأَلَّا تَنْحَلَّ الْعُرَى. And that the laces or the straps of the khuf must not become undone, right? Mustn't become undone or loose so that it's practically falling off, even though nothing has become exposed of the foot. So those are the conditions of wearing the khuf. Now we've covered all of the topics. We've covered the hukm. What's the hukm? يجوز مسح شيء من ظاهر أعلى الخفين بدلا عن غسل الرجلين في الوضوء. We've spoken about the muddah. What's the muddah? There's a muddah for the muqim, there's a muddah for the musafir. We spoke about bidayatul masah, which is تبدأ المدة من انتهاء الحدث بعد اللبس. Then we spoke about the shurut, the conditions of wearing, or rather the conditions of wiping over the two khufs, and there were in total 7 conditions for wiping over the khufs. What were they? It must be worn only after you have a complete wudu. By the way, that also precludes the situation wherein a person takes the wudu, then they proceed to put on the khufs, and before they put on the khuf, one or both, they break their wudu. Right? So then that means they're going to be putting it on not with a complete wudu, and that would be invalid. So that was number 1. Number 2, أن يكونا قويين, that both of the khufs be strong, you're able to walk on it. أن يكونا مانعين لنفوذ الماء, they must prevent the water from reaching the foot. In a sense, that's waterproof. I would actually call that water resistant, because min ghayri al-kharzi, the exclusion to that is coming in from the seams. So if it comes in from the seams, that's not waterproof, but it's also not a problem. So waterproof isn't exactly the correct word, more water resistant. Tamam? Which is why thick socks that's not waterproof also qualifies, because if you were to pour water over a thick sock or drop water onto a thick sock a little bit, a few drops, it wouldn't reach the foot, at least not immediately. As for the discussion about everyday dress socks, right? So that's of course going to be precluded. In other words, it's not going to qualify according to the Shafi'i school. Why? Because of this particular point, مانعين لنفوذ الماء, that they do not necessarily prevent the water from reaching the foot. That point there is of course based on the rajih in the Shafi'i school. That's the mu'tamad, the relied upon view in the Shafi'i school. There are other views in the Shafi'i school, the likes of Imam al-Ghazali and others, who hold that these conditions are not necessarily as stringent as they are to be found here. And there are ahadith that indicate that wiping upon the jawrabain, which is essentially usual socks, not khufs, that it's permissible. So that's the marjuh view in the Shafi'i school. And it's also views that exist outside of the Shafi'i school. And many scholars have considered that valid. So the way to deal with that as a student is that, look, according to my madhab, according to the Shafi'i school, wiping over the jawrabain is not valid according to the preponderant view. But there is a view in the madhab that allows for it, and it's not the preponderant view, it's not the view that the majority of scholars accept or consider valid in the Shafi'i school, but it's still a view that exists. So those who choose to practice it, I can sort of understand and respect their approach. I don't need to necessarily follow that. As a student studying the Shafi'i school, my primary reference is the Shafi'i madhab. When I do discover other rules outside of the preponderant views of my madhab, and I learn about them and I want to follow them, am I allowed to do so? Yes, I am. Just make sure you know all the necessary details. Don't mix and match to the point where you are going to end up doing something that nobody considers as valid. And don't do this as a habit of trying to always do the easiest thing. If you comply to those conditions, then inshallah that's also completely permissible according to the understanding of traditional scholars, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. There are of course those who opine very strictly, you must stick to the Shafi'i madhab or the rajih in the Shafi'i madhab. But this is not an approach that is conducive to most instances of contemporary living, to be so strict as to want to stick to one madhab all the time. That's generally the approach, but we don't become so inflexible as to not even consider that there are times where it is genuinely going to be within the best interests of society at large and the best interests of the servant to be more flexible, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Okay, so there are some conditions over which there's some difference. Tamam. So we leave it at that. That is the conditions of permissibility for wiping over the khufs. Now we move on to the conditions of the wudu. Shurutul wudu. And we'll just cover the conditions of the wudu and then we'll conclude on that and leave the sunan and that which breaks the wudu and what follows for the next lesson, inshallah. So what are the conditions of wudu? We spoke about the arkan of wudu, tamam, which were 6. The niyyah at the time of washing the face, washing of the face, ila akhir. Now what are the conditions of the wudu? So he first mentions the arkan, now he's mentioning the shurut. In between he had mash ala al-khuffain, which is technically part of the wudu because it's something that stands in the place of one of the arkan. Now he's getting into the shurut, and then after the shurut he gets into the sunan, then into the makruhat, that which is disliked, and then into the mubtilat or nawaqid, etc. What breaks the wudu, what nullifies the wudu, what you can't do without wudu. So it's a very systematic approach to fiqh, and inshallah after seeing it a couple of times we will have a default system, a standard system that we will apply throughout our journey bi'idhnillah. So looking at the text on screen, shurutul wudu'i. Shurut, plural of the word shart, means conditions. The conditions of the wudu. What's the difference between a rukn and a shart, right? Many students would say the one is compulsory, but this is inaccurate because both a rukn and a shart is obligatory. Without a rukn, you will not be able to have the act. The action, and without a shart you will also not be able to have the action. What's the technical definition of a shart and a rukn? A shart is that which without it the act doesn't exist. Tamam? Without it the act doesn't exist. The act requires the shart to come about. So it's necessary to have the shart as much as it is necessary to have all of the arkan. The arkan are the pillars of the act, that which makes up the act. So if you imagine building a house, tamam, then building a house has certain integrals, certain things that you cannot do without. A house must have a foundation, it must have walls, it must have a roof, right? So let's say we focus on that as our foundation, rather as our integrals. So our integrals are having a foundation, walls, and a roof. Without those integrals, you don't have a house. But then there are conditions as well. In order to lay the foundation, you need to clear the area. In order to lay the foundation, you need to make sure the ground is solid and that it can hold a foundation. So those are the conditions. If you don't fulfill the conditions, you can't have the integrals. If you don't have the integrals, you don't have the act. So both components are obligatory. How then do we understand the differences? Integrals are what makes up the act itself, which is why it's the house itself, the foundation, the walls, the roof. Without any of that, you don't have a house. The conditions are not part of the house itself, but they are those things necessary in order to build the house there. Tamam? So both are compulsory. One exists outside of the act itself, but is required in order to bring the act into existence, and the other is part of the act itself. That's the difference between a rukn and a shart. A shart exists outside of the act but is necessary, and the rukn exists inside of the act and is necessary. Tamam? So what are the conditions or the shurut of wudu? In other words, before wudu can come into existence, we need these factors. Number 1, al-Islamu. In other words, you need to be a Muslim. Wudu from a non-Muslim is not valid. A disbeliever can go through all the rituals but won't have a valid wudu. Then secondly, at-tamyizu. The person performing wudu must at least have reached the age of distinction. That is not a fixed age but differs from child to child and is considered a point of development where the child goes from being a toddler to being a prepubescent child, where the child goes from being basically completely dependent to being semi-independent. The child can now determine the difference between right and wrong, good and bad. The child can make istinja by themselves. The child can eat by themselves. Tamam? These are some of the signposts of tamyiz. Scholars have often linked it to the age of 7 based on the various ahadith that mention that age, such as muru awladakum bis salati wa hum abna'u 7 sinin wadribuhum 'alayha wa hum abna'u 10 sinin. Command your children with prayer when they are 7, and then give them a punishment when they reach the age of 10. So herein we can understand that it's a significant age. So for wudu to be valid, you don't need to have reached puberty, but it's not going to be a genuine wudu if it's a child. The child who's younger than tamyiz won't be able to really take a wudu, and they won't know what the wudu is. But the child who can, that's going to be valid from that child. Even though they are not mukallaf, they're not going to be duty bound, they'll get the reward for acting accordingly. Number 3, وَالنِّقَاءُ عَنِ الْحَيْضِ وَالنِّفَاسِ. Wudu is only going to be valid if you are free, niqa'u, being pure from عَنِ الْحَيْض, from menstruation, وَالنِّفَاسِ, as well as postnatal bleeding or postpartum bleeding. If you have hayd or nifas, you can't have wudu. وَأَمَّا, and from that which يَمْنَعُ وُصُولَ الْمَاءِ إِلَى الْبَشَرَةِ. You must also be free from anything that will prevent the water from reaching al-basharati, the skin. Amma, from that which يَمْنَعُ, would prevent وُصُولَ, the reaching al-ma'i, of water, إِلَى الْبَشَرَةِ, to the skin. Now, under this point, we can look at things like paint, anything that's insoluble, anything that water cannot permeate. Here, there are many cosmetics that come up as a question. Makeup, nail polish, certain other procedures on the eyebrows and on the hair and the like. So across the spectrum, regardless of the specifics, Brazilian this and wax that and all of these, conventions, the rule is if it creates a barrier that is impenetrable, water cannot easily penetrate that barrier to reach the skin, then that would be a preventative for the water, and thus would nullify, or rather that would disqualify you from having a valid wudu, because you don't have one of the conditions. Tamam? And this means that if you have paint on your body, or you have plastic or some glue, and you know that's going to prevent the water, you first have to remove that substance before you proceed with wudu. Then we move on, inshaAllah, وَأَلَّا يَكُونَ عَلَى الْعُضْوِ, that there should not be on the limb مَا يُغَيِّرُ الْمَاءَ, that which غَيَّرَ يُغَيِّرُ, changes al-ma'a, the water. So if, for example, the person has some moisturizing cream on the skin, now that's not impenetrable. Water can definitely mix with the moisturizing cream and reach the skin. However, if you have enough cream or any other substance that's not going to prevent the water on your skin, then when you wash your limbs, what's going to happen is that water is first going to mix with that substance. So let's say it's aqueous cream or some moisturizing cream. You'll notice the water becomes murky first as you wash it off, and only after that substance has essentially been completely washed off or mostly washed off do you then see the water being clear and actually cleaning the skin. So that's what is referred to here. وَأَلَّا يَكُونَ, that there should not be عَلَى الْعُدْوِ, on the limb, مَا, that which يُغَيِّرُ الْمَاء, that which will change the water. In other words, it's no longer going to be unrestricted water without any qualifications. It's now going to be creamy water. It's now going to be aqueous cream water. It's now going to be dirty water, murky water, right? Used water. But it's not going to be ma'ul mutlaq, unrestricted water. And therefore, you first need to remove any substance that will change the water on the limbs. Tamam? The next point, وَالْعِلْمُ بِفَرْضِيَّتِهِ. One must have knowledge that the act that one is doing is obligatory. If you don't believe the wudu to be obligatory, you consider it to be sunnah, for example, or you consider it to be not necessary, just extra, then that means the wudu is not valid from you. The next point, وَأَلَّا يَعْتَقِدَ, that one should not believe فَرْضًا مِنْ فُرُوضِهِ sunnah, that an obligation, one of the integrals of wudu, whether it's integrals or shurut, that one of its obligations is sunnah, right? It's supererogatory, it's extra, it's voluntary. This is referring to a person not who doesn't know which is compulsory and which is sunnah, nor is it referring to somebody who knows some of it are compulsory and some of it are sunnah, but I don't know which are which. nor is it going to be a problem for the one who just assumes the entire thing to be necessary. Tamam? This is a problem when somebody believes that a specific act of wudu, like washing the face for example, isn't compulsory but is actually sunnah. That would be the importance of learning and understanding before you act. The same thing applies with salah. One mustn't believe that a compulsory element of salah is actually sunnah. So it is necessary for us to learn. And then wal-ma'u at-tahuru, wal-ma'u, water, at-tahuru is a description which means not pure water but extremely pure water. In other words, purifying water. What is ma'u at-tahur? Al-ma'u at-tahur huwa tahirun fi nafsihi mutahhirun li ghayrihi. Water that is tahur is pure in and of itself and has the ability to purify something else. That's ma'u at-tahur. Allah refers to this in the Quran. He didn't say ma tahir but ma tahur because it has the ability to purify as well. Furthermore, وَإِزَالَةُ النَّجَاسَةِ الْعَيْنِيَّةِ. Another condition of wudu is that if you have najasa ayniyya, discernible, tangible filth on your person, right, on your body. Let's say on your hands or on your arms or any of the places that you need to take wudu. Then to remove that najasa is going to be a condition of the wudu. This is if a mere washing, a mere rinse is not enough to remove that najasa. That's why it says an-najasa al-ayniyya, discernible najasa. If there's filth on your person or contamination on your person, such as a drop of urine or something, but you don't know where, you don't know exactly where, you can't discern it. You just know that there's a trace. Under such circumstances, unless there's a clear indication of color, taste or smell, it's sufficient to just rinse water over that area. But if you have discernible filth that you can't just rinse off because you can still see it, it's a trace there, it's going to prevent water from reaching the skin, it's going to change the water that's on the skin. That type of najasa must be removed before starting with the wudu. Next point. وَجَرْيُ الْمَاءِ عَلَى جَمِيعِ الْعُضْوِ. Water needs to run over the entire limb. This is a very key point here because this comes from the idea that the Sharia specifies فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. Allah specifies washing in wudu. And if you simply wet a limb, then that's not washing, that's wetting, and there's a difference. This is relevant because when people travel in contemporary times with innovations such as spray bottles and the like, especially on Hajj and Umrah and other forms of travel, even in planes and the like, often people, they think they're very innovative, so they have this little spray bottle for wudu, and then they just spray a couple of times on the limb. They're basically wetting the limb and they wipe that wet water over the limb and they think that that is sufficient for wudu. That is not sufficient for wudu. The water actually needs to run over the limb. In other words, you need to be able to discern that this water isn't just wetting my limb, but it's actually running over the limb, even if it's just a little bit. So there's a few droplets that trickles down and that flows over. That's fine, but not just a few sprays to wet it and then you wipe the wetness over it. That's not going to suffice for ablution. We proceed, inshaAllah ta'ala. وَتَحَقُّقُ الْمُقْتَضِي إِنْ بَانَ الْحَالِ. It's a bit of an interesting expression here. وَتَحَقُّقُ الْمُقْتَضِي means the establishment of a factor that nullifies the wudu, that requires the wudu. Al-muqtadi يعني يقتضي الوضوء. You must have established that something happened that broke your wudu, that makes you require a wudu. In ban al-hal, if it is such a condition where it's clear, right? So for example, a person urinated or defecated or passed wind or touched a member of the opposite sex or slept, all of that is pretty clear. If it's not clear and the person doesn't know that they actually need a wudu, they are uncertain, then it's now no longer going to be a fard wudu unless they go and deliberately break their wudu. But their wudu would still be valid based on ihtiyat. They are taking wudu out of precaution, or they are taking a wudu as a matter of tajdeedul wudu, renewing the wudu. Tamam? So they would have the corresponding intention, that they are renewing their wudu or they are taking wudu out of precaution. If you don't want to go that route and you want to take an obligatory wudu, then the simple approach there is to actually just break the wudu, right? Either touching a member of the opposite sex, of course if it's permissible, or one's own private parts, or passing something from the front or rear private parts. If that's possible at the time, all of that would break the wudu, and then it would be an obligatory wudu, and Allah knows best. Then وَدَوَامُ النِّيَّةِ حُكْمًا, the perpetuality of the intention, hukman, in practice essentially. This means that you don't do anything to divert from a wudu. So you're taking wudu and you remain taking wudu for the entire time. You don't stop and then suddenly you're busy with something else now. That's no longer a wudu. In which case, so you broke away from the wudu and you went to go and do something else. When you come back to the wudu, you need to ensure that you have the intention again. وَعَدَمُ تَعْلِيقِهَا, it's also important as a condition that you don't suspend your intention. You don't suspend your intention on anything else. So for example, I intend to take wudu, insha'Allah, if Allah wills. Now, unless you meant tabarruk, I want to take some blessings from Allah. If you were saying that I'm suspending my intention of wudu based on something else, then that would invalidate it. The same thing applies with salah. You can't make salah and I'm going to continue making salah unless the phone rings, in which case I'm going to break the salah and answer the phone. That would invalidate the salah from the outset. And then finally, or rather, no, not finally, dukhul al-waqti wal-muwala, the last two is sort of a pair, right? The last two is sort of a pair. And that is, okay. Nope. There we go. Dukhul al-waqt wal-muwala. These are two concepts here. The one is, it's a condition that the waqt has entered. Now this is not referring to everyone. This is only specifically لِدَائِمِ الْحَدَثِ. So number one here and number two over here, both is referring to only this person, دَائِمِ الْحَدَثِ. Dukhul al-waqt means that the time of the prayer must have entered. Now that's not a condition for everyone. You don't have to wait for the time of the prayer to enter before you go and perform wudu for that prayer. It's only a condition for the da'imul hadath. Who is that person? We'll explain now. Wal muwalat, quick succession, meaning that you wash one limb after the other limb without taking a long break in between. You don't stop and pause and have a conversation or recite Quran, etc. You wash face and then arms and then head and then feet in quick succession. Before the one limb dries, you're already busy with the other limb. That's also not a condition for everyone, right? If somebody goes and they wash their face with the intention of wudu, and then their phone rings and they answer and they speak on the phone and they put down the phone, they don't need to repeat the washing of their face. They can just continue, because muwalat or quick succession is not a condition in wudu. It's recommended, but it's not a condition. But here on the screen, we see that there's a condition 1 and there's a condition 2. The entry of the waqt as well as quick succession. Both of these are only a condition for da'imil hadath, for a person who is perpetually in a state of non-wudu, such as a person who suffers from chronic flatulence, from incontinence, or from an array of other ailments. That means that they can never really maintain a state of ablution. So such a person has to necessarily, for the wudu to be valid, they must wait for the waqt to enter. So after the adhan for a particular waqt has sounded, only then should they proceed to performing wudu. And then in addition to that, they must also ensure that they wash their limbs in quick succession. So they can't, after washing the face, take a phone call and say, okay, assalamu alaikum, how are you, etc., and then carry on. No, they would have to start again. Why? Because muwalat, quick succession, is a condition for these people. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Tamam. Okay, so we conclude on that note, inshallah, and then in the next lesson, we will look at the sunan of wudu. What are some of the sunan, the recommended practices? What are some of the makruhat, the disliked elements of wudu? Then the nawakidul wudu, what breaks the wudu? And then finally, ma yahrumu ala man intaqada wudu'uhu, what is unlawful or haram for the person who breaks the wudu. So as a quick revision, again, our first discussion was on mashul khuffain, wiping of the khufs. There were 3 subtopics there: the mudda or period, bidayatul mash, when exactly does wiping start, shurutul mash, which is the conditions of wiping. Thereafter we looked at the wudu again. We've already covered the arkan. Now we looked at the shurut or the conditions of the wudu. And we've covered all of those 15 conditions in detail, and that concludes this lesson. Until next time, inshaAllah ta'ala, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad, subhanallahi wa bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayka, wassalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله